Former U.S. Congressman Patrick Kennedy is my guest. He's in Canada to wade into smart pot politics. He is a co-founder of SAM, which stands for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. He says, science says, pot ain't what it used to be when you were, and he was, a hard partying teenager. What got you out of it? Was it an incident? How did you recover?
I had lots of jackpots. I mean, I was arrested going through airports. I was arrested by the Coast Guard on the high seas. I got arrested by traffic cops. I mean, my disease was addiction, and it didn't matter what it was. As an addict, you know, you'll substitute one drug for another. I'm blessed today. I have 3 years and 3 months of continuous sobriety, which is, I used to have periods of sobriety because, of course, I couldn't have functioned as a congressman if I hadn't been able to, quote, manage my illness, you know, to some extent. But the difference today is I've been able to string together, you know, enough days that I'm getting further away from the problem, although it's always ever present. I mean, I have to treat my illness every single day because it's a chronic illness. And
when your brain chemistry's scrambled, you make silly decisions, no question. And you have on top of this, and I know it's one of your passions, to help people with mental health issues.
Yes.
So diagnosed bipolar, severely bipolar, how bipolar?
The thing is we really don't understand this thing called our brain. We're giving these diagnoses, and really there's a spectrum, like you hear about autism spectrum. It's a spectrum of disorders. Depression is a spectrum of depressions. Schizophrenia is a spectrum of schizophrenia. In other words, even dementia, Alzheimer's, is a spectrum. So we're really understanding very little, but I am excited about research into the brain, because it's the last medical frontier. And of course, my uncle, President Kennedy, said we would put a man on the moon in 10 years. I would like to have us go to inner space, not outer space. And I really think these neuroscientists are the astronauts of today. They're the ones who are going to have unlock the mysteries of the brain and treat our children with autism and our parents with Alzheimer's and our sisters and brothers with addiction and depression. I just think that's where we as a nation, both yours and ours, need to be focusing our energies.
And where was your father on this, or do you know?
Well,
what advice did he give you?
My dad was the champion in the Senate for the bill that I sponsored, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which was ultimately signed by President George W. Bush. So Republicans and Democrats all are afflicted by these issues, and we supported this on a bipartisan basis. Now it's the law in America that if you get health care, it needs to include mental health care, which is a big deal.
And if you get socialized medicine in America or Obamacare, that will be a small miracle.
It's a challenge because, you know, we do need to reform our insurance system dramatically. We spend more than anyone else, and we get some of the worst indicators for all the money that we're spending. We definitely could spend our money and get better outcomes if we reorganize the incentives in healthcare. So that's part of my mission today, to promote mental health and addiction treatment. And I can't be doing that while we're facing this public health threat of a new legalized drug called marijuana.
Well, and also you go back to the stigma around mental health. If you have diabetes, the doctor gives you insulin. People say, isn't that great?
Yeah.
You have a mental health issue. Everybody talks about it,
yes.
Wonders about it,
yes.
Judges you, puts a label on you as a little off, a little this, a little that.
Yeah.
And as a Kennedy, if you have a flaw, you make the front page.
Yeah, no, my denial was pretty deep because in spite of the fact that I repeatedly had jackpots, I still wasn't able to get my head around the fact I had a problem, even though it ran in my family and I should have known that I was vulnerable to it. The problem with mental illness and addiction is that if you have it, you're probably the last person to recognize it. So the real challenge we have is how to get family members to be there for their loved ones or their friends. So we're now pushing mental health first aid, much like you have CPR. Someone drops down, they need CPR, you know what to do, or they have a crisis. With mentally ill and those with addiction, we need to have the same mindset that just because we see them on the street corner doesn't mean they don't need medical attention.
I understand. And if somebody says, I'm down, I feel depressed, somebody else might say, well, snap out of it.
That's right.
And if you truly suffer from it, you don't snap out of it.
That's right. Well, I think that our awareness of this is changing. The veterans that are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan are killing themselves 28 a day in our country. There's more of our American soldiers who die at their own hands than are being killed in combat. I think this is a moment of profound change for our attitudes towards brain illnesses. And so I'm hopeful that we can take this awful tragedy of our veterans, and frankly all Americans, 38,000 Americans successfully take their lives every year, and we can start to think this is not something we can ignore anymore.
No, you lose an arm or a leg, you get way more sympathy than if your brain is disordered.
That's right.
Generally, the PTSD,
I mean, the
all of
idea that with diabetes, you wouldn't think of waiting till you needed to have your legs amputated from diabetes. You would treat it well before. With addiction and mental illness, we're doing the equivalent of saying wait until you need to have your legs amputated. It has to be a super crisis before we treat mental illness and addiction. In comparison to cancer, it would be like saying to someone with stage 1 cancer, don't come back for treatment until you have stage 4 cancer. I mean, that's simply how we treat mental health and addiction. Only when it's an urgent, acute episode do we take care of it.
Well, as you know, in the case of cigarettes, when it became socially not cool to smoke, many people didn't. When I was in university before you were born, I didn't really want to learn to smoke, but it was cool.
Right.
So like I'm in the closet trying to like get down a cigarette so I looked cool.
Right. Well, I do think what we've seen in changing attitudes towards tobacco, we could do with marijuana and alcohol. Because I think that America and my country, the fact that we have this, we embrace getting inebriated and having drugs for everything, when I think if we celebrated being, quote, above the influence and being, trying to maximize your potential, that could be the cultural norm. Just like today, when you look down the street and someone's smoking, people kind of look at them like, what's wrong with them? They need to get treatment. I'm hopeful for a day when it becomes cool to be mentally fit, in other words, to be sober and, working on yourself. I mean, we want to be better people. We all want to be better.
I know, but we have dangerous appetites and always have had. And I'm not sure, like I said, you could be a tribesman in Borneo and chewing on a coca leaf or something because there's some part of the human, and I don't understand it either, that wants to go elsewhere.
Well, that's why we call these diseases a threefold illness. It's a physical allergy, that's that addiction part. Then it's a mental obsession, that's the psychological part. And then it's a spiritual malady. In other words, you become isolated from your friends and family. And the real hope for recovery is when you can get reconnected, when you're no longer ashamed of yourself, when you have real relationships. And that's the key to success and recovery. And it's a spiritual dimension, okay? We're talking about intimacy and real bonding. So we're not feeling alone. Because part of our drinking and drugging is to self-medicate that part of us that feels desperately alone.
Sure, but we look at you from the outside and we think, Kennedy, tragedy in the family, assassinations, some tortured souls, but to be born to privilege. And summer in Cape Cod, and no Jacqueline. From the outside, in the doilied world, it looks fantastic.
Yeah.
Like, what could be better? What kind of pressure would that put you under? Did that put you under? Does it put you under?
Well, I don't think in my father's generation anyone knew what post-traumatic stress was. But I mean, my God, my dad watching both of his brothers get murdered. I mean, the rest of the world says it's a political assassination. In my family, it was a murder. I mean, what that does to a family, the devastation, I mean, it's untold.
And a cousin down in a plane.
So my point is that, we have to look at the impact of trauma because so many people can survive trauma, but we need to have support. And no one bothered to say to my dad, listen, you've lost your brothers, you've had these tragedies, you need to get some help, some support. If that had ever been the case, if we'd had a medical system that had said, with that situation, we're going to take care of you, who knows what the trajectory in his life would have been. And in turn, what our trajectory would have been, because we're I loved my dad more than anyone else in the world. I was totally impacted by his suffering. You can't grow up in a family where your parent is tortured and not be impacted by it. My mom absolutely fell into severe alcoholism, and she too was impacted by that. And then the ripple effect goes on and on.
And of course, in the public eye. I mean, most of us can be tortured in private.
Yeah.
Experience our demons and live with demons, and we don't make the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But, I got reelected in spite of myself because people knew I had a problem, but they also knew I was, trying to do something on the public policy end. And it was surprising how much support I got, because people said, no one's talking about this issue, but you are. So it's in my family too. And so I got great public support. Most politicians don't talk about these issues because they're worried that it's going to affect them politically. I think that time is changing. I think the public wants their political leadership to talk about these issues, because there isn't a family that doesn't have a family member suffering from a brain illness.
Betty Ford, breast cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, as it goes on, as a public figure, you don't have to reveal everything. But if you reveal the human side of anybody, you'll bond with the public, I would think. Are there people who say to you, Patrick, give it a rest? Like, we don't need to know any more about
my staff
you.
was always telling me, they already know this, Patrick, don't talk about it.
Right.
And
Talk
yet,
about your wedding and your new bride.
Well, I would, when I was talking about this, I had bigger crowds, more engaged crowds, more questions, more people coming up to me saying thank you. So it was counterintuitive. In fact, I became the sponsor of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act because no one wanted those words after their name as a politician. I was the youngest member of Congress, and yet I got to be the primary sponsor on a bill that said the brain's part of the body, as obvious as that is. And yet nobody wanted to be, Rep so-and-so, sponsor of a bill called mental health and addiction, right? Because then, God forbid, a press person would ask them, do you have mental health and addiction problems? So the stigma is the biggest challenge. Like with the AIDS fight, silence equals death. That is really the mantra for addiction and mental illness. Silence equals death.
And misinformation, too. Lots of misinformation when HIV/AIDS first surfaced. People were afraid to shake hands.
That's right.
Drink out of the same glasses. It was totally misinformed.
But you know what changed that whole AIDS trajectory? It was the consumer advocates who said, we're not going to let any more of our fellows die of this disease. We're going to try to change public policy. The difference with the mentally ill and those with addiction is that we're still so in the shadows. It's very hard for us to get political action. And of course, we're not a very popular, constituency. So that's what's been the biggest challenge.
Yes, and you in the shadows of great men, the RFK, JFK, your father. Lots of pressure.
And my Aunt Eunice
to be perfect.
And my Aunt Jean. My Aunt Eunice started Special Olympics.
Right.
I just have to say I'm blessed to have a family that's just done so much for social justice. And I really feel this fight for treatment and public health and mental health is part of that legacy of civil rights that my family's been part of.
I thank you.
Thank you, Fanny.
Thank you.